On a cold December night, the residents of Maplewood Apartments were startled by the distant wail of police sirens. The quiet neighborhood, known for its sense of security, was about to be shaken by a horrific crime. When officers arrived at apartment 3B, they found Alicia Lewis lying lifeless on the floor, her body covered in bruises and a deep wound on her head. A small pool of blood had formed beside her, staining the cream-colored carpet. The apartment showed signs of struggle: broken glass, overturned furniture, and a lamp knocked to the ground. A neighbor, Mrs. Caldwell, had been the one to call 911. She had heard a loud argument, followed by a crash, and then silence. When she knocked on the door, there was no response. Concerned, she looked through the peephole but saw nothing. That's when she decided to call the police. As the investigation began, detectives immediately noticed something unusual. A half-packed suitcase sat on Alicia's bed, as if she had been planning to leave. A torn photograph was found near the suitcase, a picture of her and a man, but his face had been ripped away. Who was he? And was he the reason for her sudden departure? As detectives dug into Alicia's personal life, they uncovered a shocking truth. She had been having an affair with a married man named Francis Corey. A well-respected businessman, Francis was known for his charm and picture-perfect family. He had a wife, Annie Ryan, and 2 children, and from the outside, his life seemed ideal. But behind closed doors, he was living a double life. Friends of Alicia told detectives that she had grown tired of being the other woman. She had given Francis an ultimatum: leave his wife or lose her forever. But Francis had made excuse after excuse, unwilling to destroy his public image. Investigators believed this confrontation might have led to her murder. Security footage from the apartment complex revealed something critical. At 11:46 p.m., just minutes before the estimated time of Alicia's death, a man matching Francis's description was seen entering the building. Though his face wasn't visible, the figure was wearing a dark coat, the same coat Francis was known to wear. Even more suspicious, at 12:15 a.m., the same figure was seen leaving in a hurry. As police questioned Francis, his wife, Annie Ryan, emerged as another potential suspect. When confronted with her husband's affair, Annie didn't deny knowing about it. In fact, she admitted that she had found out months ago. But what she said next sent chills down the detectives' spines. She had confronted Alicia earlier that same day. Annie confessed to visiting Alicia's apartment around 4 p.m. She claimed that she had gone there to demand that Alicia leave Francis alone. The conversation quickly escalated into a heated argument, and at some point Alicia had shoved Annie, leading to a physical struggle. Forensic investigators later found something shocking. Alicia had a bite mark on her arm, and DNA analysis confirmed it belonged to Annie. Annie insisted that she had left Alicia's apartment unharmed and never returned. But could she be lying? Could a betrayed wife, filled with rage, have returned that night to finish what she had started? Or was she simply another victim of Francis's deception? Forensics found something strange at the crime scene: a small button near Alicia's body. It didn't belong to any of her clothes, and when investigators checked the surveillance footage again, they realized something crucial. When the mysterious figure entered the building at 11:46 p.m., his coat appeared to have all its buttons. But when he left at 12:15 a.m., one was missing. Detectives searched Francis's home and found the same coat in his closet. But something was off. One button was clearly missing. This discovery made him the prime suspect. Meanwhile, another clue surfaced. A trash bag found in a nearby dumpster contained a pair of leather gloves. Inside the gloves was traces of Alicia's blood. Even more incriminating, police found a single blonde hair inside. Francis had blonde hair. When confronted with the evidence, Francis maintained his innocence. He claimed he had been at home that night, asleep beside Annie. But Annie contradicted him. She said she had woken up around midnight and Francis was nowhere to be found. As detectives continued to dig, they made a heart-wrenching discovery. Alicia wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for her unborn child. A medical examination revealed that Alicia was 3 months pregnant, and DNA tests confirmed the father was Francis Corey. This changed everything. If Francis had known about the pregnancy, his motive for murder became even stronger. Was he afraid that Alicia would expose the truth and ruin his perfect life? Had he killed her to keep his secret hidden? But there was another theory. What if Annie had found out about the baby? Would she have killed Alicia out of revenge, knowing she was carrying her husband's child? As the case deepened, one thing became clear. Someone had wanted Alicia silenced, and they had gone to extreme lengths to make sure she never spoke again. As detectives continued to question Francis Corey, the cracks in his alibi widened. Initially, he had told investigators that he was at home sleeping beside his wife, Annie, on the night of Alicia's murder. However, when Annie was questioned separately, she admitted that she had woken up around midnight and realized that Francis was missing from their bed. This contradiction alone raised suspicions, but it wasn't enough to charge him. To dig deeper, investigators examined Francis's phone records and found something suspicious. At 11:58 p.m., a call was made from his phone to Alicia's number. The call lasted only 6 seconds, as if someone had dialed and immediately hung up. More importantly, cell tower data revealed that Francis's phone had not been at his home during this time. Instead, it had pinged off a tower located just a few blocks from Alicia's apartment. Investigators then checked the GPS data from Francis's car and found even more evidence against him. The records showed that his vehicle had left his house at 11:30 p.m., traveled toward Alicia's neighborhood, and remained parked there for approximately 40 minutes before heading back home at 12:20 a.m. This timeline matched perfectly with security footage that captured a figure entering Alicia's apartment building at 11:45 p.m. and leaving just after midnight. When confronted with this evidence, Francis suddenly changed his story. He now admitted that he had gone to see Alicia that night, but he insisted he had only wanted to talk. He claimed that he was trying to end things for good and that he had left her alive. However, detectives were not convinced, especially as new evidence continued to emerge. As investigators built their case, they received a breakthrough from an unexpected witness. Jessica Lane, a resident in the apartment across from Alicia's, stepped forward with crucial information. She told detectives that she had been taking out the trash around 11:40 p.m. when she noticed someone standing outside Alicia's door. At first, she assumed it was Alicia's boyfriend, but something about the figure seemed off. They appeared hesitant, as if debating whether to knock or not. Jessica didn't get a clear look at the person's face due to the dim lighting, but she remembered one important detail. The individual had long, dark hair tied in a bun. This was significant because Francis had short hair, but his wife, Annie, had long hair. This revelation added a new layer of suspicion. If Jessica had really seen a woman outside Alicia's apartment, had Annie been there that night? Had she followed Francis and witnessed something she wasn't supposed to? Or worse, was she the one who had killed Alicia in a fit of jealousy? Detectives knew they needed more evidence before they could draw any conclusions. As investigators searched for answers, they made another shocking discovery, a letter hidden in Alicia's desk drawer. This letter, dated the day before her murder, was addressed to Annie Corey. In the letter, Alicia confessed to having an affair with Francis, but insisted that she was done with the lies. She revealed the most shocking truth of all. She was pregnant with Francis's child and could no longer keep it a secret. Alicia wrote that she planned to tell the world, whether Francis liked it or not. One chilling sentence stood out to detectives. "I'm sorry you have to find out this way, but you deserve to know the truth. Your husband is going to be a father again, and I won't let him walk away from this." Investigators believed that this letter could have been a major turning point. Had Alicia already confronted Francis about the pregnancy? If so, was that what led to the violent struggle that ended in her death? More importantly, had Annie seen the letter before the murder? If she had, did it push her over the edge? Detectives also found something unusual in Alicia's apartment, partially burned papers in the fireplace. They retrieved the fragments and, after piecing them together, discovered that it was a copy of the same letter. This suggested that Alicia may have printed two copies, one for Frances and one for Annie. The question was, had Annie read it before Alicia died? With the new evidence in hand, detectives decided to bring Annie in for further questioning. This time, Annie was no longer the composed, confident woman they had seen before. She looked nervous, her hands trembling as she lit a cigarette. When asked if she had ever seen the letter, she hesitated before shaking her head. But investigators noticed something crucial, a burn mark on her hand. Realizing that they had partially burned papers from Alicia's apartment, detectives began to wonder if Annie had been the one who tried to destroy the letter. When they presented this theory to her, Annie finally cracked. She admitted that she had been at Alicia's apartment that night, but swore that she had not killed her. According to Annie, she had followed Frances after suspecting that he was lying to her. She arrived outside Alicia's door around 11:45 p.m., just as Jessica had reported. Annie listened through the door and heard the sound of a heated argument between Frances and Alicia. Then she heard a loud crash, followed by a scream. After that, there was silence. Terrified, Annie ran away before she could see what had happened. If Annie was telling the truth, then Frances was still the prime suspect. But detectives needed one final piece of undeniable proof to charge him with murder. The breakthrough came when the autopsy report was finalized. The medical examiner determined that Alicia had not only suffered a head injury, but had also been strangled to death. The marks on her neck indicated that she had fought back, scratching at her attacker's hands in a desperate attempt to survive. Investigators had already collected DNA samples from Alicia's fingernails, hoping they might hold the key to solving the case. When the test results came back, the evidence was overwhelming. The DNA found under Alicia's fingernails belonged to Francis Corey. Confronted with this, Francis could no longer maintain his lies. His face went pale as detectives laid out the final timeline. He had gone to Alicia's apartment, hoping to convince her to keep quiet about the baby. When she refused, the argument turned violent. In a fit of rage, he had shoved her, causing her to hit her head. But when she tried to call for help, he panicked and strangled her to death. Realizing what he had done, he hastily wiped his fingerprints from the room, grabbed his coat, and left. However, in his rush, he had missed one crucial detail. A button from his coat had fallen off at the crime scene. This small but critical piece of evidence placed him at the scene beyond any doubt. Francis Corey was arrested for the murder of Alicia Lewis. As he was led away in handcuffs, his wife, Annie, stood in silence, watching the man she once loved being taken away. She had followed him that night, hoping to catch him in an affair, but instead, she had witnessed the horrifying reality. Her husband was a killer. After Francis Corey's arrest, the case quickly moved to trial, drawing significant media attention. Prosecutors were confident, armed with overwhelming evidence, including DNA under Alicia's fingernails, GPS data from Francis's car, and the security footage placing him near the crime scene. His shifting alibi and Annie's testimony about his disappearance on the night of the murder further strengthened their case. Francis, however, pleaded not guilty, claiming that while he had been with Alicia that night, her death had been an accident. His defense attorney argued that the argument had escalated, and in a moment of anger, he had pushed Alicia, causing her to hit her head. They maintained that Francis never intended to kill her, and that the strangulation marks on her neck could have been caused by something else, like CPR attempts. The prosecution, however, countered that Alicia's injuries were not consistent with an accident. The autopsy report showed that she had been strangled for nearly a full minute, which meant someone had deliberately choked her, ignoring her struggles until she stopped breathing. Additionally, the letter Alicia had written to Annie, revealing her pregnancy, was presented as a possible motive. Prosecutors suggested that Francis had panicked at the idea of Alicia exposing their affair and his unborn child, leading him to kill her in a desperate attempt to silence her. Annie Corey was called to testify, and her account of following Francis that night, overhearing the argument, and seeing his coat missing from the house added further credibility to the prosecution's case. She also admitted to finding and burning the letter, an action that, while questionable, suggested she had initially tried to protect her husband before realizing the full extent of his crime. As the trial progressed, the jury listened intently, but one major question still lingered. Was this a crime of passion or a premeditated murder? Just when the trial seemed to be heading toward a clear conviction, a shocking new witness came forward, changing everything. The defense presented Derek Miller, a former co-worker and close friend of Frances, who claimed that Alicia had been emotionally unstable and manipulative. According to Derek, Alicia had previously threatened to harm herself whenever Frances tried to break off the affair. He suggested that, on the night of her death, Alicia might have initiated the fight, and Frances had only acted in self-defense. The defense tried to use this testimony to introduce reasonable doubt, arguing that Alicia could have attacked Frances first, and that he may have strangled her only in an attempt to stop her. However, prosecutors quickly dismantled this argument by pointing out that Derek had no proof of his claims, no messages, no emails, nothing to back up his story. Furthermore, Alicia had no history of self-harm or emotional instability, according to her family and friends. The prosecution then presented evidence that Frances had searched online for ways to erase fingerprints and conceal evidence just days before Alicia's death. This suggested that he had been thinking about covering up a crime, further weakening the self-defense argument. The jury now had to decide, was Frances a man who lost control in a moment of passion, or was he a calculated killer who had planned Alicia's death? After weeks of testimony, the jury finally reached a verdict. On the day of the announcement, the courtroom was silent as the judge asked the foreperson to deliver their decision. We, the jury, find the defendant, Frances Corey, guilty of first-degree murder. A collective gasp spread through the room as Frances's expression hardened. He showed no emotion as the judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The prosecution had successfully proven that this was not just a crime of passion, but a deliberate act of murder. Frances had gone to Alicia's apartment knowing she planned to reveal their affair and pregnancy. He had tried to silence her once and for all, but in the end, his own mistakes had led to his downfall. Annie Corey sat motionless as her husband was led away in handcuffs. Despite everything, she had once loved him, but now she realized she had been married to a murderer. With the case closed, Alicia's family finally had justice, though the pain of losing her would never truly heal. Even though the trial had ended, the story was far from over. In the months following Frances's conviction, Annie struggled to rebuild her life. She had been humiliated in the public eye, and despite not being involved in the murder, some still blamed her for staying with Frances for so long. She eventually decided to leave town, seeking a fresh start somewhere new. Meanwhile, investigators uncovered one final piece of disturbing evidence. In Frances's old storage unit, police found a hidden box filled with old letters, photographs, and a disturbing collection of surveillance pictures of Alicia. Some of the letters were from Alicia, expressing her love and frustration over their secret relationship. Others, however, seemed to be written by Frances, but had never been sent. Dark, obsessive messages about how Alicia belonged to him and how he would never let her go. The most chilling discovery was a handwritten note dated a month before Alicia's death, in which Frances wrote, "If she tries to ruin my life, I'll make sure she doesn't have one to ruin." This was the final proof that Frances had planned Alicia's murder long before that fateful night. It wasn't just an argument that got out of hand, it was a premeditated killing. Despite the overwhelming evidence, some questions still remained. Had Annie truly known nothing about the murder? Some speculated that she had helped Frances cover up parts of the crime, especially since she burned the letter. However, there was never enough proof to charge her with anything. Another mystery was the role of Derek Miller, Frances's co-worker who had testified about Alicia's supposed emotional instability. Some believed he had lied on the stand to protect Frances, possibly under pressure or even bribery. However, with Frances behind bars, there was no way to prove if Derek had been involved in any deeper conspiracy. As time passed, the case became infamous, often discussed in true crime documentaries and books. Some saw it as a cautionary tale of betrayal and obsession, while others saw it as a tragic story of love turned deadly. In the end, Alicia's murder left a lasting impact on everyone involved. Francis would spend the rest of his life in prison, haunted by his actions. Annie, though free, would always be tied to the case. And Alicia, young, hopeful, and about to start a new chapter, was gone forever, leaving behind a story that people would never forget. With the trial over and the verdict decided, Francis Corey was sent to a maximum security prison, where he would spend the rest of his life. At first, he refused to speak to reporters or anyone who wanted to interview him about the case. He was placed in a cell away from other inmates for his own safety, as high-profile murderers often became targets in prison. During his first few months behind bars, Francis seemed to show no remorse. He maintained his innocence, telling his lawyers that he had been unfairly convicted. He even filed an appeal, claiming that the jury had been influenced by media coverage and that there was no real evidence proving that Alicia's death was premeditated. However, the court rejected his appeal, stating that the evidence against him was overwhelming. Over time, however, Francis began to change. He became quieter, more withdrawn, and started spending long hours in the prison library. Some inmates said he seemed to be writing something, though no one knew what it was. Rumors spread that he was working on a confession, or maybe even a diary explaining what really happened that night. One day, a journalist who had covered his trial received an anonymous letter from inside the prison. The letter was allegedly written by Francis himself, and in it, he admitted to the murder. He wrote about how he had felt trapped by Alicia's pregnancy and had feared that she would ruin his life by exposing the affair. He described how he had gone to her apartment that night not knowing what he was going to do, but once the argument started, he couldn't stop himself. She kept saying she would tell Annie, that she wasn't afraid anymore. I begged her to keep quiet, but she wouldn't listen. I don't know when I decided to kill her, but I remember putting my hands around her throat and squeezing until she stopped moving. It wasn't an accident. I wanted her to stop talking, and I made sure she did. The confession was shocking, but since it was an anonymous letter, the courts could not use it as an official statement. Still, it confirmed what everyone already suspected. Francis had killed Alicia intentionally, out of fear and rage. While Francis adjusted to life in prison, Annie Corey struggled to move forward. The trial had destroyed her reputation, and many people in town blamed her for what had happened. Some believed that she had known about the murder from the start and had tried to protect her husband. Others felt sorry for her, seeing her as another victim of Francis's lies. Despite the controversy, Annie decided to leave town. She sold the house she had shared with Francis and moved to a different city where she could start fresh. She changed her last name, cut off contact with people who only saw her as the murderer's wife, and tried to rebuild her life. However, no matter how far she moved, she couldn't escape her past. True crime documentaries, articles, and online discussions about the case constantly mentioned her name, questioning whether she had been more involved than she admitted. Some amateur detectives even tried to contact her, demanding answers. In a rare interview, Annie finally spoke about her feelings. People think I knew, but I didn't. I suspected something was wrong, yes, but I never imagined he could kill someone. When I burned that letter, I was trying to protect my marriage, not cover up a crime. I loved Francis once, but I will never forgive him for what he did. He destroyed Alicia's life, and he destroyed mine too. Despite her words, some people still doubted her innocence. The town where Alicia had lived would never forget the case, and Annie would always be tied to the man who had committed the crime. Years passed, and the case faded from the public eye, but one last revelation would change how people saw Francis forever. A journalist who had been following the case decided to investigate Francis's past further. Through interviews with old acquaintances and former classmates, the journalist uncovered disturbing details about Francis's past relationships. It turned out that Alicia wasn't the first woman he had hurt. In college, Francis had dated a girl named Megan Ellis, who had filed a restraining order against him after their breakup. She had claimed that Francis had become obsessed with her, following her home and threatening her when she tried to move on. However, since Megan had moved out of state, the case had never gone to trial, and Francis had never faced serious consequences. Even more disturbing, police found that Francis had once been investigated for another woman's disappearance, a woman he had briefly dated before marrying Annie. The woman, named Sarah Collins, had vanished without a trace, and though there was no solid evidence linking Francis to her disappearance, people now suspected he might have been involved. With these new discoveries, people began to wonder if Alicia had been his only victim. Had Francis been a dangerous man all along, hiding behind his respectable image? Had he killed before and gotten away with it? Though no new charges were filed against him, the truth was clear. Francis Corey wasn't just a man who lost his temper one night. He had a history of violence and control, and Alicia's murder was likely not the first time he had hurt someone. With this final revelation, the case was truly closed. Francis remained in prison, haunted by his own past. Annie continued to live in the shadows of the crime, trying to escape the whispers of suspicion. And Alicia, young, full of potential, and ready to start a new chapter, remained a tragic reminder of how obsession and fear could lead to irreversible destruction. As the years passed, Francis Corey grew older and weaker in prison. The once confident and charming man who had fooled so many people now lived in isolation, avoided by most inmates and forgotten by the outside world. His high-profile case had made him a target, and though he was not physically attacked, he faced constant verbal abuse from fellow prisoners who despised him for what he had done. At first, Francis tried to maintain his arrogance, believing that he could still prove his innocence. He continued writing letters to lawyers, requesting another appeal, but every attempt was rejected. The courts had already decided his fate, and there was no more sympathy for him. Slowly, he began to lose hope, realizing that he would never leave prison alive. His health started to decline, and by his late 50s, he was diagnosed with a serious illness. Some say it was cancer, others say it was heart disease. Whatever it was, the once proud man withered away, spending most of his time in the prison infirmary. As his condition worsened, he had no visitors. Annie, who had long since cut ties with him, refused to answer his letters. His former friends wanted nothing to do with him. He was alone, just as Alicia had been in her final moments. In what would be his final statement, Francis reportedly admitted to more than just Alicia's murder. In a conversation with a prison chaplain, he confessed that he had been responsible for Sarah Collins' disappearance years ago. Though he didn't reveal where her body was, he admitted that she had tried to leave him, and just like with Alicia, he couldn't let her go. This confession confirmed what many had suspected all along. Alicia wasn't his only victim. Not long after, Francis Corey died in prison, his name now synonymous with deception, betrayal, and murder. Even after Francis's death, the impact of his crimes remained. True crime documentaries and books continued to tell Alicia's story, making sure she was remembered not just as a victim, but as a young woman whose life was stolen too soon. Her family, still heartbroken, worked to raise awareness about domestic violence and coercive control, hoping to help other women recognize the warning signs before it was too late. Annie Corey, despite years of trying to escape her past, would never truly be free from the shadow of her husband's crimes. She had remarried under a new name, but every so often journalists or internet detectives would track her down, forcing her to relive the nightmare. Some still doubted her innocence, though there was never any evidence proving she had been involved in Alicia's death. As for the town where it all happened, the case became a chilling piece of local history. The apartment where Alicia had lived remained empty for years, considered haunted by her tragic fate. Some people claimed to hear strange noises at night, whispering voices or soft cries. Whether it was real or just the weight of the town's guilt, no one knew. In the end, the case of Francis Corey wasn't just about one crime. It was a story about lies, manipulation, and the consequences of unchecked obsession. It reminded people that sometimes the most dangerous person isn't a stranger. It's the one you trust the most.